Good morning. I'm here with Dr. Os Guinness. He's going to be sharing with us all 3 days of our global gathering. We're going to have 3 separate interviews. Today, we're going to look back a little bit at the past, tomorrow at the present, and then on the third day, looking more into the future. So Oz, it's really great to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking time to be here.
Great privilege. I'm just sorry I'm not with you in person.
We wish you could come as well to Bangkok, but we're glad we can glean from you, even though with modern technology. I want to start today by looking a little bit into the past and some of your personal life. And I wondered, could you share with us a bit about your upbringing and your family heritage?
Well, as many people know, I'm a member of the Guinness family. Arthur Guinness, the original brewer, was a fine old evangelical, and my side of the family has kept the faith ever since. So my great-grandfather was the leading preacher at the grand old age of 23 in the Irish revival of 1859. And he volunteered to go with Hudson Taylor to China, and Hudson Taylor turned him down because he was told at 30. Hudson Taylor told him, found a college and send us out missionaries. And he did that in London, the first modern missionary college. He founded 3 missionary societies and sent out 1,500 missionaries to Latin America, to Africa, and above all to Asia. My grandfather went as a doctor, founding one of the first Western medical hospitals in China, treated the last emperor, and I was born in China. So I greatly appreciate what you're doing, because I've lived in the capital of then China, the then capital of China, and also my parents were in Singapore, and I lived in Hong Kong, and then back in London, so I appreciate very much what you're doing.
Wow, so you know exactly what it's like to be a third culture person.
Indeed.
How does your upbringing influence your passion today, especially considering what's going on in the world in places like Ukraine with Russia, even the current situation with China and Taiwan?
Well, my first 10 years in China, surrounded by war, famine, revolution, death. My 2 brothers died in a famine. You know, on the one hand, it's given my faith an incredible realism. That's the real world. But on the other hand, an appreciation of what it means for the church to suffer persecution and to live under the challenge of Marxism. So I was a 7-year-old when my dad said to me, son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has just abandoned the city and we're at the mercy of the Red Army. And then, of course, began the 2 years of the Reign of Terror. But years later, when I was a student at Oxford, I met Sir Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher of freedom. And the first time we met, it turned out he'd been a 7-year-old in the Russian Revolution, and I'd been a 7-year-old in the Chinese Revolution, the 2 great communist revolutions of the 20th century. And as we talked and compared notes, we said, as it were, thank God that the English-speaking people had stood up against totalitarianism, Hitler, Stalin. But he would never have believed, and I wouldn't have then, to think that the West as a whole, and now America, deeply affected, not by classical Marxism, communism, but by cultural Marxism. So my first 10 years put me in good stead in terms of realism and an appreciation of the threat of authoritarianism.
Wow. Can you unpack for us what you mean by cultural Marxism?
People think of Marxism as communism, which it is. That's classical Marxism. But the French Revolution only lasted 10 years in France. But like a gigantic volcanic explosion, the lava flow has flowed out ever since. In the 19th century, with what's called revolutionary nationalism. Very few follow that today, although one of the people who does is the leading thinker, Carl Schmitt, behind Xi Jinping in China. The main lava flow in the 20th century, but designed in the 19th by Karl Marx, communism, revolutionary socialism. But what we're facing in the West, and particularly in America, is not classical, but cultural Marxism. And that goes back to a gentleman called Antonio Gramsci, sat in jail under Mussolini, and he tried to figure out why Marx wasn't right. He shifted the thinking from economics and politics, industrial strikes and all that stuff, to what he called the cultural gatekeepers. Win the cultural gatekeepers of society, you sweep round and win the whole. His ideas were picked up by the so-called Frankfurt School, and in the 1960s, the leader of it in America, Herbert Marcuse, called for a long march through the institutions. In other words, win the colleges and universities, win the press and the media, win what he called the culture industry, Hollywood, entertainment. And then you sweep round, like Mao did in China in 1934, and win the whole game. Now, of course, 50 years later, they've done it. And to the surprise of many, people would have thought, say, American business would have been a last fortress of conservatism. Now you've got woke business and woke finance and even woke West Point and woke Naval Academy and the beginnings of a woke military. In other words, the long march, cultural Marxism, call it critical theory in all sorts of branches, has made incredible inroads.
Okay, now, help us here to understand a little bit. As followers of Jesus, how is this such a concern? I know that some people who are watching may be thinking, well, there's socialism in Europe and there's capitalism more in the US and different parts of the world, and they may see this as just different social structures that are not related to the Bible and to our beliefs as followers of Christ. But obviously you feel that this is a threat in some way, not to a social structure, not to a national government.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
To that too.
To that too, yes, of course. But
Well,
also as followers of Jesus. So
Put it this way. You see in Genesis 1 to 11, the bookends. Reinhold Niebuhr put it, these bookends in Genesis are the bookends of human history. On the one side, anarchy. All freedom, no order. The world before the flood. On the other hand, authoritarianism. All order, no freedom. The Tower of Babel. And you can see that in history. So anarchy is unlivable. And when you have the chaos of that, people long for order, and you swing off into the other extreme, authoritarianism. The American Republic and the highest views of European freedom, say the English-speaking world, come from the Exodus, the Torah. You have a view, not anarchy, not authoritarianism, ordered freedom. Freedom in the Old Testament within a covenant. In the American system, freedom within a constitution. So, the highest view of freedom, justice, peace in community the world's ever seen. So we don't throw it away lightly. In other words, we'd be squandering not only the strong biblical roots, but the possibility of freedom, justice, human dignity, and so on. And the alternatives, remember the extremes, much of the world is swinging towards authoritarianism. And that's the danger of where we are today.
This is fascinating for you to share with us. So before we close today, how do you feel all of this affects your calling personally at this stage of your life?
Well, we all have different callings, and mine is along the lines of making sense of the world and then making sense of the gospel to the world. In other words, you can put it in two words, analysis and advocacy. So you can see today the American experiment is in deep trouble, and I'm trying to address a lot of public life. And a lot of the Christian responses are very, very confused. So I've never felt more engaged on that level. Of course, that's the sort of public thing. We're called to follow Jesus and love the Lord with all our heart and so on, and look after our families and do all sorts of other things. But the heart of my calling is in those public things, and I'm fully stretched today.
Well, and we're glad you're engaged with all of that and engaging with us today. We're glad to have had Oz with us. We look forward to the next 2 days. If you would like to read more about some of what Oz has to say about the Chinese and Russian and French revolutions versus the US Revolution and how the Bible plays into that, I encourage you to pick up this book. This is the Magna Carta of Humanity, and it's Oz's latest book. He has another one coming out soon, but I think this is your most recent. And it's a fantastic read. It'd be great for you to take a look at and learn a little bit more from Dr. Guinness.